What's up guys, it's Paraly5er here. Today we're doing our final tier list for Grounded 1.4. This is the mutation tier list, ranking every mutation in the game from best to worst, and here we go. This is the final tier list we'll be doing in Grounded, and one of my final Grounded videos probably, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The first mutation we have to rank here is Annihilator. Now this mutation increases your damage dealt to black, fire, and red ants by 25% at phase 3, and also increases damage resistance to black, fire, and red ants by 10%. So a very useful mutation. I highly recommend using this one for taking down the red ant nest in the high new game pluses, and also for taking those orc fire ants out during the Java-matic defense. I'm going to put this mutation in A tier. I'd say you can't run it all the time because, you know, there are enemies that aren't ants that this doesn't work against. But when you are fighting ants specifically, this is the best mutation in the game for that. It's extremely good on the Java-matic, which you need in New Game Plus anyway. It's extremely good for fighting the red ants, which you're going to need to fight a lot in New Game Plus 3 and higher if you're trying to get trinkets. And overall, a very good mutation, which I like a lot. So for that reason, it's going in A tier. Next up, we have Ambassador. Now, this is a brand new mutation in 1.4 and is the most recent addition, and this makes it so that when you have phase 1, you are friendly to red ants, phase 2 makes you friendly to red and black ants, and phase 3 makes you friendly to red, black, and fire ants. Now, this is a staple mutation in my loadout now. I'd say this is... Honestly, I think this is an S tier loadout purely for the fact I can run around the upper yard and not get mutilated non-stop by fire ants. I was so sick of the fire ants, especially when building mixers, like the super mixers in the upper yard, and since the new update, I haven't had to worry about it, because I just go befriend all of the ant queens, and all of a sudden, none of the ants attack me, and it's just much, much easier. It makes running around the nests much easier as well, and yeah, it's just a really, really useful mutation. I highly recommend that you get it and use it for running around the yard, so for that reason, it is S tier. I love this mutation. Next up, we have Apex Predator. Now, this mutation has multiple different effects for multiple different weapons. If you're using the Club of the Mother Demon, it has a 20% chance to apply venom to your enemies. If you're using the Scythe of Blossoms, it has a 20% chance to increase the attack speed by 25% for 10 seconds. If you're using the Bard's Bow, it has a 20% chance to give a buff that spawns in a friendly wasp. And if you're using the Blaster of the Moldy Matriarch, it has a 20% chance to give an effect that spawns a puddle. So overall, this effect works on a lot of different stuff. I think the Club of the Mother Demon effect is not very good. The Bard's Bow effect isn't great either. The Summoning of the Wasp just doesn't really do much, to be honest. The Scythe effect is really good, though, and the Blaster of the Moldy Matriarch effect is also pretty good. I'd say this is a solid B tier mutation. It does work well for those two weapons, but outside of that, I wouldn't really recommend that you use this mutation. So, yeah, if you like the Scythe or the Blaster, then I would use Apex Predator. If you don't, then there's absolutely no use to it at all. The biggest issue here is it doesn't work on infused weapons. It works on the infused blaster, but it doesn't work on the infused club or the infused bard's bow or the infused scythe. So that takes away a lot of its use in the high new game pluses. So for that reason, it's going in B tier. It's not great, but it's decent, I guess. The next mutation in the list is Assassin, which makes it so daggers inflict a bleed damage over time effect that deals 75 damage over the time of 5 seconds, and it lowers enemies' resistance to bleed damage by 25%. I'm just taking into account the stage 3 effects, of course. There is a huge issue here, and that is in the high new game pluses, the bleed just isn't as good. Like, enemies get more health the higher the new game pluses, and this doesn't really change the effect of Assassin. Like, it's still only going to do 75 damage over 5 seconds. It's not like a percentage thing. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier. When you're in the high new game pluses using a dagger, there's no point in using Assassin because the bleed is going to do barely any damage because the enemies are going to have so much health. It just really isn't worth it. I'm mostly factoring like really heavily into the high new game pluses here. I've done tier lists in the past where I've taken into account like non-new game plus. Today I'm mostly factoring in like how high of a new game plus could you use these mutations to, and with Assassin you just couldn't use it at all in the high new game pluses because it just is too weak. So for that reason it's going in C tier. Not a fan. It does however reduce enemies' resistance to bleed, which I guess does because it's a percentage, that does come across as a pretty useful effect, but there just isn't much bleed in the game, so C tier, not great, not a huge fan. The next mutation we have on the list here is Barbarian, which makes it so that when you do a club attack, you enter Rage mode, and you deal 25% more damage. However, it becomes much harder to parry. This will also let you regen 1 health per second. Now, this mutation is a solid B tier. I definitely like to use this if I'm using the Club of the Mother Demon or the Salt Morningstar against the Wasp Queen or the Mantis. They're both very, very useful in that situation. It does a lot of damage and takes the boss down really, really quickly before it can do too many attacks, which is very good. However, outside of that, I don't really find myself using it too much. It becomes too difficult to parry, and you take a lot of damage just fighting regular enemies in the backyard. So I'd say while it does have a couple of specific use cases, you can't just apply that across the entire yard, and so for that reason, it is a B tier mutation. Next up, we have Bardic Inspiration. You obviously get this for defeating the Wasp Queen, and it gives all of your bow and crossbow attacks a 25% chance to play a Bardic Melody, which buffs all nearby players for 10 seconds. One of the effects increases crit strike chance by 10%, another increases the damage of your attacks by 20%, and another reduces the damage you take by 25%. I would say this is an A tier mutation. If you're playing in multiplayer, this mutation is amazing and you absolutely have to use it. It's S tier. You should have someone running a bow using this mutation and it's very, very good. However, if you're playing in single player, you simply can't use this because you'd have to switch your gear out too much. It would take too long. It just wouldn't be worth it. So for that reason, I'm putting it in A tier. It is really, really good, but only in multiplayer. In solo, it's just not really usable. So yeah, definitely give it a go if you're playing multiplayer. The next mutation we have is Battle Buddies, which decreases players' damage on other players by 75% and increases resistance to damage taken from players by 75% as well. This is a pretty good mutation. Usually, if you're playing multiplayer, especially on 2-player, only one of you needs to run this as it applies both ways. If you're playing on 4-player, it's kind of different. You'd kind of have to have 3 out of the 4 people run it, I guess. Which is a bit more difficult. This mutation can be useful. It stops you from like doing too much damage with like a spicy staff to your teammates or like bombs to your teammates. Or it also works against yourself. So if you bomb yourself, it can usually damage you, but with this mutation, it'll reduce the damage. I'm gonna say this is a B tier mutation. It can be quite useful in medium or low difficulty, especially in the higher new game pluses if you don't want to kill your teammates. Only one of you needs to run it in 2-player, which can be quite nice, as it only takes up 1 mutation slot. And because a lot of the mutations aren't that useful in the high new game pluses, you actually do kind of have room to run this mutation and give it a go. So yeah, obviously in single player, it's almost useless, but not completely. If you're using the Moldy Matriarch Blaster, it can be useful, but other than that, pretty useless. But I'd say it's a solid B tier mutation. It definitely has its uses. Next up, we have Blade Master, which makes it so when you hit your enemies, it's going to reduce the attack damage that they deal by 30%. And it also makes it so that when you do a sword attack, it reduces your exhaustion time by 90%. This mutation is easily A tier. Obviously, it only works with swords, but it's very, very useful, very, very good. Reducing enemies' attack damage by 30% is extremely useful in the high new game pluses because they do so much damage that that big reduction, and that is a percentage, is very, very good and very, very helpful. Reducing exhaustion recovery time by 90%, also amazing. Obviously, in the higher new game pluses, stamina isn't as much of an issue due to Milk Molars giving you so much stamina, but when you do finally get exhausted, being able to recover almost instantly is very, very useful. For that reason, I'm putting it in A tier. Unfortunately, the reason it can't quite be S is I don't love using swords too much, so it kind of doesn't help that it only applies to swords. If it applied to something like axes, it'd be an amazing mutation, but swords for me just aren't the best weapon choice in the game, so that kind of limits my choice of which sword I'm going to use, and thus limits where this mutation can go on the list. Next up, we have Buff Lungs. I'm going to go ahead and put this in C tier. I'm also going to move Meat Shield into C tier while I'm at it. Neither of these mutations I would personally choose to use. You could use them before you go into New Game Plus, but they increase your stamina or your health by 50. Your maximum health or stamina. Once you're in high new game pluses, 50 health or stamina is nothing. These are useless, they just don't do much. It would be much better if they increased your health or stamina by 10% or 20%, because a percentage boost is much more useful than a raw number boost. A raw number boost just doesn't cut it in the high new game pluses. So by the time you get to new game plus 1, these mutations are useless, because you've already got like plus 250 health or something ridiculous, and you've got plenty of health to work with, so you just don't need these. Especially in the really, really high new game pluses when you've got like 900 health, what's the point of getting 50 extra? It just isn't worth it. So I'm going to put them in C tier because they can be used pre-New Game Plus, but after New Game Plus, they're just completely useless and I wouldn't recommend them at all. Next on the list, we have Cardio Fan, which increases stamina regen by 30% and decreases exhaustion time by 30% as well. This is probably one of the best stamina mutations in the game. Me personally, I'm going to put it in S tier. It's my favorite stamina mutation to use. It is just very, very useful for recovering your stamina, and I know that stamina isn't a huge issue in the really high New Game Pluses, but this mutation kind of is the one stamina mutation I will always run, regardless of if I'm in New Game Plus or not. As soon as this is unlocked, it's getting equipped. It just makes recovering stamina so much easier and so much faster, and I just can't live without it, to be honest. I pretty much have it always on, so for that reason, it has to just be an S tier mutation for me. Next up, we have Chopper. Now, this mutation makes it so that chopping attacks with the axe will reduce enemies' resistance to busting, chopping, and stabbing damage by 20% for 2 seconds. This mutation is extremely useful. It's definitely S tier. If you're using an axe, you pretty much don't need to worry about if the enemy is resistant to chopping, because this will make it so that you already do 20% more damage anyway. It is a very, very good mutation, very, very useful, and I highly recommend you have it equipped. You should definitely be using this to take down any enemies when you're using an axe. Obviously, it does only work with axes, but since axes are so powerful, even into New Game Plus, with the Acid Edge and the Fresh Edge and all the other axes, I highly recommend you're always running this mutation with those axes because it's just so, so good. Once you get to New Game Plus 4, maybe you're switching to the Club of the Mother Demon and you won't use this as much. But even still, to carry you all the way to New Game Plus 4, it has to be an amazing mutation, and it is, and for that reason, it's going in S tier. Next up, we have Corporate Kickback. Now, this makes it so blocking an attack has a 5% chance to give you an effect that will cause all of your melee attacks to refresh your health by the amount of damage that you deal. Now, in the high New Game Pluses, you're dealing a lot of damage, so for that reason, you're healing a lot of health from this effect. It doesn't proc too often, so it's not that useful. However, I will be putting it in A tier, because when you do need it, this thing can be insanely good. In boss fights where you parry a lot, like the Infected Broodmother, this effect is very useful. Outside of boss fights, it's not too useful, because you're not parrying a crazy amount of attacks when you're fighting your enemies, so maybe, you're not going to use it just running around the yard. But when you're in a boss fight, like against Schmechter, or against the Infected Broodmother, or even against the regular Broodmother maybe, you're going to be parrying a good amount of attacks, and when you do, this effect is going to allow you to heal massive amounts of HP, which is very, very useful. So for that reason, I'm putting it in A tier. It's definitely a good mutation, and I definitely recommend you use it. Next up, we have Coup de Grace. This increases your crit hit chance by 5%. This is a very good mutation. It's a big boost to crit chance. Critting can be important, and the most important thing here is noting that in the higher New Game Pluses, this percent boost giving you more damage is one of the few ways to increase more damage other than upgrading your weapons, and for that reason, I'm going to say this is an A tier mutation. I love critting. I always run this in the high New Game Pluses because I'm always looking to do as much damage as I can in those boss fights and just take the boss out as quickly as possible, so this mutation is a must-have for that. I highly recommend anyone who is in a boss fight uses this mutation to deal as much damage as possible. Even outside of boss fights, you could run it to do more damage across the yard. It's obviously not as effective on slower swinging weapons, and I do use clubs, but it still is pretty good, so for that reason, I'm putting it in A tier. Next up, we have Daredevil. It's D tier. It's not useful before you go into New Game Plus. It's not useful once you go in New Game Plus. It reduces your fall damage by 50%. It's god-awful. The fall defense on trinkets is better because it will make you immune to fall damage, and this effect is just completely useless. It's D tier. Don't ever use it. Don't ever buy it. Don't ever equip it. Well, you might want to buy it if you want 100%, but don't ever equip it. And yeah, D tier, terrible effect. Next up, we have Dissection Expert, which increases the drop chance of loot from creatures by 10%. S tier. This is a must-have mutation. You should always have this equipped while you're in New Game Plus, going around killing things and looting them to get as many trinkets as possible and as much infused ooze as possible as well. There's just no doubt in my mind, S tier mutation. Don't even need to explain it. It is just amazing. You should always have this equipped while you're running around the yard. Next up, we have a Fresh Defense. Now, this makes it so you have a 50% increased resistance to gas and burning damage and a 75% reduction in sizzle. This is a solid mutation. I'm going to put this in B tier. I'd say before New Game Plus, it's an A tier mutation. However, once you go into New Game Plus, you don't really need it as much for the sizzling or for the gas damage because you can get gas guard and sizzle immunity, so it becomes pretty useless in those scenarios. However, in the high New Game Pluses, you can equip this and it'll reduce the burn damage you take from the spicy effect that infused enemies have. So if an infused enemy hits you that has spicy and it hits you with a spicy ball, it'll give you a burn. This will reduce the damage that burn does. So if I have a free mutation slot, I'll usually chuck this on before going going into a boss fight, just to try and reduce any burn damage that I do take. For that reason, it goes in B tier. It can be pretty useful in New Game Plus, but not crazy useful. Next on the list, we have Grass Master. This is going to increase your chopping efficiency by 100%, and it's going to make it so harvesting grass has a 100% chance to return 15 stamina. Now, this mutation can be very useful if you're going around the yard collecting grass. Obviously, it's not going to be useful anywhere else. That's what the mutation is for. I do quite enjoy using this when I'm collecting grass. Obviously, in the high New Game Pluses, you have so much stamina that you're never going to run out. Even if you're collecting grass, it's just going to be so much, you're going to run out once in a blue moon. I'll put this in a solid B tier. I think it is a useful mutation. It does have its utility. However, you obviously aren't going to run it inside of any boss fights or anything. And it's just useful for running around the yard collecting resources. So it's a solid B tier mutation. Next, we have Guard Dog. This is a mutation that increases your damage during factional raids by 50%. This includes the Java-matic, the Mixers, the Super Mixers, the Cortana defense, and any factional raid on your base as well. This is a very, very good mutation. It's just S tier. To be honest, I always run this during the Java-matic. It is one of the best mutations in the game. If you're doing any of the Mixers as well, you should always have it equipped. Increasing your damage against those creatures is extremely useful, and it just makes it so much easier to do. Always run this mutation, especially on the Java-matic, and for that reason, it is definitely an S tier mutation. It has to be used. Our next mutation is Hauling Hero. You obviously get this when you get maximum coziness, and it's going to boost your hauling strength by 15. Very, very good effect. Very useful for carrying stuff around the yard. However, in New Game Plus, you're going to have the Handy Gnat, and the Handy Gnat's just going to be able to carry 25 things by default anyway, whereas when you have this equipped, you can only carry 20 as the character, so you can't even carry as much as some tiny little gnat. You could equip even more stuff in terms of gear and equipment to make your carry strength higher, but we're purely talking about Hauling Hero here, and I'm going to put this in B tier. I think pre-New Game Plus, very useful. I think once you're in New Game Plus, not as useful because of the Handy Gnat, but it can still be somewhat useful for carrying more things around, so I give it a solid B tier. Our next mutation in the list is Javelineer, which makes it so that spear attacks reflect 200% of the damage you take back to your attacker, as well as increasing spear throwing damage by 30% and increasing spear charged attack damage by 30% too. I'd say the main boost here is that you're going to get the increased spear throwing damage by 30%, which is very, very useful. Obviously, we love percentage increases. They're where it's at. I'd say this is a solid A tier mutation. The increased spear throwing damage is very, very good. And if you love throwing your spears and picking them back up and doing that consistently, you can produce a lot of damage, and the 30% boost from this is insanely good. However, I'd say I don't like the Thorns effect or the charge attack effect. So for that reason, it is going to be an A tier purely because throwing spears is so strong, especially in the early game. In New Game Plus, it can still be very good throwing spears, and you can get those infused spears, which are very, very powerful as well. So I give this a solid A tier. Next up, we have Juicy D tier. This makes it so your thirst decreases 50% slower. It is terrible, useless, and you should just never use it, especially in the high New Game Pluses. Your thirst drain is like 0.1%. Why would you need to decrease it by 50% even more? Just doesn't seem like it has a point in the game whatsoever. One of the most useless mutations, full stop. Don't even bother with it. The next mutation we have is Lil Fist, D tier. Getting this mutation is a pain because you need to get 200 kills with your fists, and if you've already gone to New Game Plus and you forgot to get this, you're going to need to kill 200 things with your fists in New Game Plus, where they have more health. This mutation's terrible because fists are god-awful and one of the worst weapons in the game. I wouldn't recommend you use this whatsoever. It makes it so that your fists have a 2% chance to stack damage, but if you get hit, then all those stacks instantly all get cancelled, and the stack is also capped at 100. It also makes it so every punch landed guarantees a second hit that deals 6 damage and 5 stuns, so it's like each of your punches is doubled. But it's just terrible, it's useless, and it's a D tier mutation because fists are just god-awful at this point in the game. The next mutation on our list is Mantsterious Stranger, which makes it so your attacks have a 2% chance to spawn a friendly Mant, which does a lot of damage. He lasts a little bit of time, and he's pretty cool. Now, this is really good if you're running the Summoner build, because this thing will just get hit by the enemy, you'll have Summon Thorns on, and it'll just absolutely obliterate whatever boss you're fighting. He's very, very OP for that. I'm going to put him in B tier. If you've got a free mutation slot and you don't know what to run, usually you just chuck on the Mant and he'll help you out in the fight. I'd say one issue in New Game Plus is you got to be careful that if you have this guy summoned and he gets hit by the boss that you're fighting or any enemy that's infused, then it will trigger the infusion effects of that enemy, which can be really annoying in the really high New Game Pluses. You got to make sure you keep your distance from your own summons. However, he can be really, really useful, especially with that Summons Thorns build. He's going to obliterate any enemy just by getting hit. So for that reason, I'm putting him in B tier. He can be very good, and he's a pretty cool addition to the game. So for that reason, B tier. Next in the list, we have Merteen, which increases your underwater oxygen time by 11.25% and increases your swim speed by 15%. This is a pretty cool mutation. I'm going to put this in B tier. I find myself using this if I want to go into the water, just so I can swim faster. Oxygen obviously doesn't matter because you're going to have equipped the chip, the pond chip, by the time you get to New Game Plus, and you'll just have infinite underwater time. But pre-New Game Plus, very useful for getting to the pond lab. Once you're in New Game Plus, it's useful if you ever want to go back to the pond lab and collect stuff, like if you're trying to collect the muscle sprouts or re-get the super chip every time you go to New Game Plus. I'd say this is a solid mutation. I'm going to put it in B tier for that reason. I recommend you use it while you're underwater, but outside the water, it is completely useless. So it is a B tier mutation. Up next, we have Mithridatism, which increases your resistance to poison damage by 75%. I'm going to put this in C tier. While it is a percentage, poison just isn't really that OP in the higher New Game Pluses. Enemies just aren't going to do a lot of damage with poison to you because your health is going to be so high that it just won't do much whatsoever. You don't really need to run Mithridatism to reduce that poison damage. The only time I'd maybe run this is if you were fighting the Broodmother or the infected Broodmother, as you're going to basically be poisoned for the entire fight, so you might as well run this to reduce some of the damage that you take. It obviously doesn't work on Venom, which is really annoying. However, you could run this for those situations. You could run it if you're really taking a lot of poison damage before you get to New Game Plus, but once you're in New Game Plus, it's not really an issue, so it's a C tier mutation. The next mutation on our list is Mom Genes, and this makes it so attacks and perfect blocks have a 10% chance to summon friendly spiderlings with 25 health each. It also increases damage dealt with poison attacks by 50%. This is a solid C tier, probably. I wouldn't really recommend you use it that much. Even with a summoner build, it's not that good. The Thorns just doesn't do enough damage because they have such little health. And yeah, it's really not a great mutation. I hate to say it. You have to beat the Broodmother to get it, and even once you do get it, the only thing this could be useful for is distracting the enemies that you're fighting if you need to buy yourself some time to heal. But other than that, I wouldn't really recommend you use it. So for that reason, it's going in C tier. The next mutation we have is Natural Explorer, which increases your movement speed by 50%. S tier. One of my favorite mutations in the game. I always run this if I'm running around the yard. Obviously, this deactivates once you enter combat, so you don't want to use it if you're in a boss fight or fighting enemies, but as long as you don't parry an attack or hit an enemy, you shouldn't enter combat even if you get hit by an enemy, so you can just keep running and not worry about it. This is one of my favorite mutations in the game, makes you get around the yard so much faster, and for that reason, it is 100% an S tier mutation. Next up, we have Parry Master, which makes it so when you parry attacks, you gain 100 stamina per parry. Now, this is insanely good. If stamina was a huge issue, then this would be really useful, like pre-New Game Plus. Once you're in New Game Plus, stamina isn't as much of an issue, but this still is a pretty useful mutation. I'm going to put it in A tier. I think it's very good. I personally prefer Cardio Fan. That's why I have it in S tier. The biggest issue with Parry Master is it doesn't work if A, you're not parrying, or B, you're not fighting. So if you're running around the yard and you run out of stamina, Parry Master ain't going to do anything for you. If you're fighting enemies running like Barbarian on a club, Parry Master isn't going to do anything, but Cardio Fan will, which is why I prefer Cardio Fan. However, Parry Master is very, very useful and is very good for stamina recovery. You pretty much will never run out of stamina if you're fighting things like wolf spiders or the Broodmother, because you'll just gain all that stamina back instantly. Into the final row now, and we have Rascal Rogue. This makes it so that you have a 10% chance to steal items from enemies when you're hitting them. This obviously only works with melee attacks, it doesn't work with ranged attacks, and you can only steal one item per enemy with Rascal Rogue specifically. I'm personally going to put this in C tier. The only time I'd ever use this was to steal the unique trinkets from the enemies, or if I'm really looking to farm something heavy, like Twinkling Shells which isn't even really that useful. Or maybe when I'm looking to steal stuff from enemies, like if I'm fighting a Black Ox and I need horns, maybe I'll steal it, but stealing just isn't really that good at all. You only really use this when you're trying to get certain trinkets, like the Speed Droplet or the Giddy Goop. You could use it to steal both of those, obviously, but outside of that, just not really that good. It also steals the Volatile Fang from the Infected Wolf Spider. I just don't really like this mutation. It's going in C tier, doesn't really increase your loot that much, and in New Game Plus, I just don't really use it at all. So yeah, C tier mutation, not a huge fan. Next, we have Reliable Friend. Now, this is a complicated one. It increases player revive speed by 75%, which is insanely good. But the reason it's complicated is because where do you rank it? In single player, it's a D tier mutation. You would never use it, it's completely useless. In multiplayer, it's S tier. I think overall, I just put it in S tier, to be honest. This is an insanely useful mutation, and I'd pretty much always run it in multiplayer. Whenever you need to revive someone, you just switch to this mutation, and you can revive them pretty much instantly. A very, very good mutation, and yeah, for that reason, it is S tier. Our next mutation on the list is Rock Cracker, which increases your busting efficiency by 100%. Now, this mutation is pretty useless. It's going in D tier. Just not a fan, personally. I wouldn't really recommend you use this at all. I've never found myself equipping this. The only time I'd maybe use it is to harvest clay with a shovel, but even then, it's not really that useful. So, in my opinion, it's just a D tier mutation. I wouldn't recommend it. Next up, we have Sharpshooter, which makes it so when you land an attack with your bow or crossbow, it increases your crit chance by 20%. It also makes it so that candy arrows all gain their own special effects, like mint arrows slowing down your targets, sour arrows dealing additional stun, or spicy arrows inflicting a burn damage type, which does 50 damage over the course of 5 seconds. These effects are all really useful, but the main thing here is that 20% crit chance. I'm gonna say this is a solid A tier mutation. It's insanely good if you're running a bow or crossbow, and yeah, I don't really use them too often, but if you're using that specific build, it is really, really powerful. It makes you do so much damage, and the crits are just insanely good, especially when paired with Coup de Grace and Trapper-Peeper. You just do an insane amount of damage every time you crit, and you crit pretty regularly because of the massive boost. So for that reason, it is absolutely A tier. Our next mutation on the list is Shocking Dismissal, which makes it so when you block an attack, you have a 20% chance to trigger an effect that turns your next melee attack into an electric AoE that does 75 shock damage and 40 stun. Now, this is a lot of stun, 40 stun is huge, and 75 shock damage is also a good amount of damage. Obviously, shock damage doesn't work on any of the robots, as they're immune to it, but what I would say is this is a very solid effect. The 75 damage can be pretty limiting in the higher New Game Pluses, though. I'm gonna put this in B tier. I do like running this sometimes in certain fights. It unfortunately does damage your teammates, so if you're playing multiplayer, you pretty much can't use this mutation. It's just gonna stun and damage your teammates non-stop. However, in single player, it can be very useful. It deals a good amount of damage, especially pre-New Game Plus. I always run this mutation. Once I'm in the high New Game Pluses, maybe not so much because it doesn't do as much damage, and there's just other options which are percentage increases, which are just better. But I'd say it's a solid B tier mutation, and I highly recommend that you give it a go. Next up, we have Smasher. Now, this mutation slows target attack speed by 30% for 10 seconds, and gives hammer attacks 50% more stun. Now, I think previously I would have put this in D tier. Now I'm going to put it in C tier. The effect from this is amazing, but completely useless because all of the hammers are terrible. However, in 1.4, they added the Salt Chipper, which is an amazing hammer. There is a tier 3 salty hammer that you can use that's two-handed, and it's very, very powerful. You definitely should run Smasher when you're using this. It does work with Smasher now, it didn't used to, but this effect is amazing, and I'd highly recommend you use it on that Salt Chipper. However, outside of the Salt Chipper, I would never personally use it. So for that reason, it goes in C tier because it's useful on one singular weapon. Next, we have Sour D tier. Sour Sensation is D tier. This makes it so you reflect 150% of the damage you take back at the attacker. I don't like taking damage, so I don't want to reflect it back at my attacker. For that reason, it's going in D tier because I don't want to take damage to deal damage. Terrible mutation, not a fan in the slightest. Our next mutation is Spicy Safety, which reduces the damage taken from smashing and stabbing attacks by 50%. This is S tier. This is a really, really, really good mutation in New Game Plus because it reduces the damage by 50%. Having a percentage reduction is insanely good because the enemies deal so much damage in New Game Plus that if you can reduce it by 50%, that takes away so much of the damage you would have taken. Obviously, it only works against smashing and stabbing attack types. However, there are a lot of enemies that deal these attack types, like the roly-polies, the Black Ox beetles, the ants. all of the ants deal stabbing damage. Also the mosquitoes as well, like there's so many enemies this is useful against. For that reason it goes in S tier. It's very, very useful. It's going to basically save your life against a lot of these enemies and reduce the damage you take massively. So for that reason it's absolutely an S tier mutation. Our next mutation is Spore Lord, which makes it so when you deal explosive damage, you have a chance to apply buffs to yourself. There's a 10% chance you give 1% resistance to all explosive damage. There's a 5% chance you give a 1% increase to your movement speed. There's a 5% chance you give a passive regen of 0.5 health every 3 seconds. And there's a 5% chance that gives you a 1% increase to explosive damage. All of these are tiny, tiny, tiny increases. And for that reason, this goes in D tier. You'd have to be in a fight that lasts a long, long time, which there aren't many of for this to become useful. You could be in the IBM fight for a long time and boost this, but you're never going to deal damage because the IBM heals from explosives. You could be in the Wasp Queen fight, but you're never going to hit her because she flies. So really, this only becomes useful in the Mantis fight or the Broodmother fight. The Broodmother's already so easy to kill that this would be useful in that fight, so it's only useful against the Mantis, and I personally hate using explosives against the Mantis and just in general, so it's going to give you such a small, tiny, tiny amount of stacking bonuses that it's just not worth it at all. So for that reason, it's D tier. I just don't like this mutation in the slightest. Our next mutation is Paraly5er. Now, obviously, this is very difficult to get as you're going to need 60 gold cards, but it's going to boost your crit damage by 60% in that 3rd stage. And I'm going to say this is a solid A tier mutation alongside Coup de Grace. Once you're in New Game Plus, you're going to want to run this against the bosses so you can deal as much damage as possible. It is very, very powerful. It basically increases your crit damage by 60%, which if you're running a build that is going to crit pretty regularly is a big, big difference. Trust me, it does so much damage. It's definitely worth getting. It is difficult to get because of all the gold cards you need, but remember, once you get to New Game Plus 5, gold cards are going to be flying out of the enemies so easily. It's really not going to be a challenge to get. So for that reason, it is an A tier mutation. Next up, we have Truffle Tussle, which makes it so when you hit an enemy with your fists, you have a 10% chance to create an explosion that does 75 damage. Now I'm going to put this in C tier. I hate fists, and I would never, ever, ever use this against enemies. The only reason it's C tier is because if for some reason I've forgotten to bring a bomb with me, I can bring an enemy over to a cracked rock and punch it with this mutation equipped, and eventually it will explode and blow up the rock instead of blowing up the enemy. I just don't even care about using this to kill enemies. I only want to use it to blow up cracked rocks. So for that reason, it's C tier because it has a small utility use outside of its actual intended effect. Last, but certainly not least, we have Whittle Wizard. This makes it so mint attacks reduce enemy movement speed by 30% for 5 seconds. Useless. Sour attacks deal 6 extra stun. Not really that good. But finally, spicy attacks deal 75 damage every 5 seconds. It also makes it so staff attacks apply a buff that reduces the cost of stamina for them by 50%. This mutation is a difficult one, because with the mint staff, it's rubbish. With the sour staff, it's rubbish. With the spicy staff, it's amazing, and it's really good in particular against the Wasp Queen, because those spicy damage is going to tick her health down, as well as ticking down the health of all of her summons, killing them really quickly. I'm going to say this is a solid A tier mutation, because it just is really, really useful for that Wasp Queen fight. And it's definitely good if you want to run a spicy staff build, which you could run in multiplayer. I wouldn't really run staffs in single player, but for that specific fight, it's pretty useful, and it is a good amount of damage, and that stamina reduction is also nice. So for that reason, it's A tier. That is my final mutation tier list and the final grounded 1.4 tier list I will be doing. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, don't forget to leave a like on the video. I will see you in the next grounded video. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.